All right. So, folks online, you've got the PowerPoint up. We've got it on the side TVs, and apparently, IT fixed the microphones, but it did not fix the the projector tonight. So I think we're halfway there. So let's start with this, and I'll check back in every few minutes to see what the online folks are seeing. Tonight's good evening. I've already warned you there are going to be a lot of slides. That's intentional. I've got a friend who teaches economics who had a point about how PowerPoint can be good and PowerPoint can be bad. It can be good at presenting information. He also had the Gettysburg Address in a PowerPoint, and it was the most boring thing you'd ever seen. It completely lost all of its beauty, and instead it was just point by point the problems that you had. So one of the things I try to avoid is to have too much information on PowerPoints. We've got about 25 slides tonight, but that's because each one is one discrete bullet point. So this is a two-part lecture. We're now going to look at the supply side of things. And part of that supply side of things is to look at how the firm makes its production decisions. And I'll start with an introduction and talk about why supply and why the firm and why that's important. And you probably already guessed, right? Economics is supply and demand. We've already studied demand. So it's time to study supply. But it gets a little more thorough than that. I'm going to start with a little bit of basic theory of the firm and some key concepts. Then we're going to look at production and costs. And then close up tonight's lecture with how firms maximize profits. Give you a hint, it has to do with marginal thinking, because most things do in economics. And then next week, we're going to look at the market structure. That is, your constraint. If you're a firm, you take inputs and you produce outputs, and you've got a certain internal production schedule, and you've got recipes for doing so. But you have to take into account what the market looks like. So that's going to be next week, and we're going to see that there are two basic kinds of firms, price takers and price searchers. So I'll come back to that next week for the lecture, but the bottom line is basically a price taker is a firm that is so small and so insignificant in the market that it has to accept the market price. It can't do anything other than take the market price. So its only decisions are going to be how much to produce, but it cannot engage in strategic pricing policy. On the other hand, a price searcher is a firm that has a unique product that it's making, or it's the only one in the market, so it's going to have to decide where to set its price. It could set a super low price and sell a lot, but not make very much on each unit, or it could sell a super high price and not sell very much. So the extreme example of a price taker, typically in agriculture, if you're producing wheat and the price of a bushel of wheat is $10 per bushel, you can't just show up and say, well, I'm going to produce a little more wheat and offer it at 15 a bushel. No. The market price is $10 a bushel. There's nothing you can do about it. On the other hand, Apple, for the sake of argument. Some people love their Apple computers. Apple could sell its laptop for $7,000, $10,000. Nobody else makes Apple computers. Well, a few people would buy them, and Apple would make a lot of profit on each individual computer. But how many computers do you think it would sell for $8,000 or $10,000? Not many at all. Or Apple could say, well, you know, our cost of production is pretty low. We're getting pretty good at this. We're going to sell each computer for $100. But then it's not making very much on each computer, so it's going to sell a lot. So it's going to have to decide somewhere between 100 and 10,000 what the best price is to maximize its profit. That's the big difference between the two. So for tonight, we've studied demand. Now we need to look at supply. And the fundamental question is, how does a firm organize resources? I'm going to toggle for a moment out of the PowerPoint and check the board to see if there are any comments or discussions here. Audio is good on Demeter Joe's end. Okay. Good. So just wanted to double check that. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now. Thanks for your patience as we work on this. So we look at supply. Here's a simple question I like to ask classes. So with undergrads, I drag these things out for about 20 minutes because sometimes it takes a little more time to get their attention. With you guys, I'm going to make it quick. If I'm looking for a research assistant or a teaching assistant, a TA, how many of you would be willing to work for me for $1 an hour? Not particularly interested, right? How many of you would be willing to work for me for $5 an hour? Still nobody. How many of you would be interested in working for $50 an hour? Now suddenly I've got a lot more interest, but not everybody. How about at $200 an hour? Now everybody's interested. What way we just demonstrated, you have an opportunity cost. That's the whole point. You have an opportunity cost. And because of your opportunity cost, all the things that you could be doing, whether financial or personal or studying or whatever it is, because of your opportunity cost, I am going to have to bid you away from alternate uses. That's basically the law of supply. The law of supply is going to say that with a heavier reward, a bigger price, that's going to entice more people to come into the market because it's worth their time. At $1 an hour, you've got better things to do than work for me. But if I'm paying $200 an hour, suddenly you're thinking, yeah, this is pretty good. Maybe I'll give up a few other things. So the law of supply simply says that there's a positive relationship between the price of a good and the amount of it that suppliers are willing to bring to the market. Pretty straightforward, pretty basic definition. So that means, of course, that price and quantity supplied move in the same direction. It's the opposite of demand. If the price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. It's cheaper, so people want more. On the flip side, most of you think of yourselves as consumers, presumably. Most of us are consumers on a daily basis. So one good way to think about supply is to imagine for a moment that you're supplying your labor. That's what all of us supply. A few of us have business experience, a few of us have run companies, but most of us fundamentally have supplied our own selves, our own labor. So you can think of that. How much are you willing to supply at different prices? Is it worth your time getting out of bed? Is it worth your time not playing video games? Is it worth your time not studying? Is it worth your time having a second job? $1, $5, $50, $200 an hour. And so based on that, price of a good goes up, firms are going to bring more to the market. And as a sidebar note, this is one of the really neat things about markets. We don't have to have a central planner. We don't have to have a committee in Washington, D.C. telling us how much to produce. If suddenly consumers are jumping onto a product and they really want it, that's going to drive the price up. Now that's going to help ration on the demand side, but it's also going to mean that suppliers are suddenly going to say, aha, there's a reward to be made. Let me serve the consumer by bringing more to the market. So the market's going to have that kind of adjustment process. Likewise, if a price falls, suppliers are going to think to themselves, well, wait a minute. I'm still paying my inputs. I'm still paying my workers. I'm still paying my natural resource suppliers. I'm still paying the rent. But I'm not making as much on the sales side. So I'm going to cut back or go do something else. And that's a signal. That's the market speaking, essentially saying, hey, Mr. Entrepreneur, hey, Ms. Supplier, you are wasting resources in a world of scarcity. Stop doing that. Step out and go do something else. So it's kind of like if I were to decide that I'm going to repeat this example once or twice more throughout the class. I'm going to engrave the Declaration of Independence on a grain of rice with laser technology and sell it to you. Well, I'm very quickly going to get a signal from the market that I'm wasting my time because my lasers are very expensive and students are going to pay, what, $5 maybe? I think I have one student once $10 and I think he was just trying to get a better grade. But who would pay that for a grain of rice? Well, that's the market giving me a signal saying, go do something else. And we're going to see that that market signal is really important in terms of adjusting the price because companies can temporarily make an economic profit. We'll talk about that. But that means that other companies are going to try to come in and compete with them. That serves the consumer. And then when companies are making a loss, some of the companies in that area, in that business, are going to drop out. But that means that their resources get used for something else. So imagine you're a typewriter manufacturer in 1965. Life's pretty good. You're good. How many of you learned how to type on a typewriter? I remember I had the old IBM typewriter. Well, you could be the best typewriter manufacturer in 1965. Life is good. By 1995, life's not so good anymore. You could be the best typewriter manufacturer, but nobody's buying typewriters. How many of you brought typewriters to college? I did, but this was 1990. Well, that's basically saying all those people working for the typewriter company, And all those minds, the marketing managers and the accountants and the technicians, and all the resources going into typewriters, the plastic and the electronics, etc., they're not being used in a way that serves the consumer. And that's going to be shown in the fact that the price is going to fall. So the typewriter manufacturers are going to go out of business, and their inputs, their resources, are going to get channeled to something else. And that's the market process. Let me toggle over here for a moment to see what's going on with the chat. PowerPoint, we've got a question here. Okay, so we're going to zip back to PowerPoint. So what are the determinants of supply? Resources are going to be an important one. So we've already talked about that entrepreneurs have to bid resources away from alternate uses. That resource could be you guys, workers. So you graduate with your MBA. How are you going to be bid away from other uses? By a more attractive compensation package, salary, benefits, etc. So we jumped across, that's okay, we'll jump to that in a second. Technology is going to be one of the determinants of supply. If it's really hard and expensive to make something, and then the technology gets better and better over time, we're going to see an increase in supply. So one of the things that we saw is computer technology got better over the years. That means it's cheaper to make computers, so we're going to see an increase in the supply of computers. The cost of the factors of production. Factors of production are just a fancy way of saying inputs. So economists like to break up factors of production into three categories: land, labor, and capital. Now, land is a little more broadly encompassing. Land is any natural resource. So if you're making a car, for example, rubber for the tires is going to fall under the category of land. Even though it's not really land, it's a natural resource. Iron, plastic, glass, all those things are falling under the land category, natural resources. Labor, of course, which is the workers. Capital, which is the machines that you use. And then the recipe to put all that together is the entrepreneurial talent. How are you going to organize things? So you can even think of something, if you're trying to mow a lawn, you could have the best lawnmower person in the world who's won championships in mowing lawns with a pair of scissors. That's not going to be terribly efficient. Or you could have this riding mower. Now robots might change this a little bit, but you could have I think it was a Home Depot $4,000 riding mower and nobody to ride it. No labor. That's not going to get the job done. Now, with a small lawn, it doesn't really matter. But let's say you have a landscaping business. You have to have the workers, you have to have the machines, but you also have somebody, the brains behind the operation, to decide how much you're going to charge. How are you going to organize things? Are we going to have 4 people working on one lawn at the same time and get it done quickly, and then they move on to the next lawn? Or is it more efficient to have one person working on the lawn at a time? Teams of 2, teams of 5. Those are the questions where the entrepreneur and the manager. The number of sellers in the market, obviously. If you've got 1 or 2 sellers in the market, you're going to have a small supply. As sellers drop out of the market, supply falls. As sellers enter the market, supply increases. And expectations, this is the flip side of the supply one. If the price is expected to go up next week, companies are going to hold off and leave the goods in their warehouse. And then next week, they'll bring it to the market when the price is higher. Strategic pricing. And then the final one with supply is legal rules. Criminalization or decriminalization. What do you think happened to the supply of alcohol in the US after the passage of the 18th Amendment? It went down significantly. No, it did not go down to 0. But with Prohibition, it went down significantly. After the passage of the 21st Amendment in 1933, 13 years later, things got I was going to say things got better. The comedian W.C. Fields once said, "Prohibition was a terrible time. For 13 years, I had to live on nothing but food and water." But after 13 years, Prohibition ends, the supply of alcohol is going to increase. Now, I'm not allowed to talk about this for too long because I could talk about it for an hour, but I want to share a few things. One of the things that I look at in my own personal research is barriers to entry. So I think I may have mentioned on the first night of class, in order to be a licensed emergency medical technician, on average in the US, you need to take about 400 hours of training. This I like. So if I fall and hurt my leg or my arm, I want somebody with training. In the US, on average, to be a barber, you need 2,000 hours of training. That's a barrier to entry. That's basically the barber saying, we don't want other people competing with us, increasing the supply, driving the price down, so we're going to keep them out. And you get all sorts of rules like that, and some actually become kind of funny. I was talking to a, I'll just say it, we're all among adults. I was talking to a bartender the other day, great conversation, sources of income, information. The story was basically that by law, bars have to stop serving at a certain time, but they're allowed to continue serving as long as they offer prepared food. Now, prepared food means that they're not allowed to reach into the refrigerator and pull out a slice of apple pie. That's not prepared. But they're allowed to reach into the refrigerator, take out a slice of apple pie, drizzle some chocolate sauce or a little bit of whipped cream on it and serve it, and that's considered prepared food. Therefore, they're allowed to continue. Have I shared the story of, and I'll stop with that because otherwise I could talk for hours, the story of the distillery in St. Augustine? So there's in St. Augustine, Florida, there's an old historic building. It's got a distillery with a bar attached to it, bar restaurant. Now, you would think that the two are owned by the same person because in the same building and it's kind of the same business, right? Making alcohol and selling it to people is kind of the same thing. But no, in Florida, you're not allowed to be a distiller and a seller of alcohol. But it gets better than that because you would think that the bartender running the bar in the restaurant is out of the St. Augustine gin or the St. Augustine rum and would go down the stairs and across to the distillery, pick up a case and go, no, that would be way too simple. Instead, here's what happens. A semi-truck pulls up into the parking lot. The truck driver goes out, picks up a number of cases from the distillery, puts them on the truck, drives them from St. Augustine to Tampa, where the distribution center is. That same truck then drives back from Tampa to St. Augustine, parks in the exact same spot because it's the same door entrance to the distillery and the restaurant, and then brings the cases of liquor into the bar and restaurant. That's the way it is. And I could go on with stories and stories like that. But that's one way, and this is one thing that you're going to have to think about. There are basically two ways that you can make extra money, right, if you're a manager. One way is you offer a better product, or you make it for cheaper, better and cheaper. The second way is you can lobby the government for a favor and ask the government for a favor, sometimes in the form of a campaign donation or some other form of influence, and you can have your opposition, your competition, barred from participating in the market, or you can have a monopoly license granted to you. And this is a game that people play. So for example, Uber, which I think is not only a great service. How many of you use Uber or have used Uber? Okay. So Uber is basically what taxis do, except they'll show up to wherever you are. You can put it directly on your credit card. You don't need to have cash with you. And the drivers get rated, so they have to be polite and friendly. And I've noticed in a number of cities, like Washington, D.C., the cab drivers used to be awful when we were in college. There was a weird zoning system, and you might have to pay an extra $7 just because the cab driver took you across the street from where you asked to be dropped off because the cab driver knew the zones and you didn't. Well, by the time Uber rolled around, the taxi drivers suddenly had the competition they were facing. The taxis got cleaner. The zone system was dropped in favor of a meter system. There's now an app to call a taxi, and you can pay for a taxi with a credit card, whereas it used to be cash. They've upped their game. On the other hand, if you go to Austin, Texas, Uber is illegal. It's banned completely because the taxi drivers are politically well connected and have kept out the competition. So one of the questions you're going to have to ask yourself is, if you're working for a powerful company that's politically well connected, are you willing to play the game of politics to try to advance your profit? or you're going to decide that's not something you can do, and you will only use politics to protect yourself from those who would try to block you. Question that you have to ask. So let me check in on the online folks and see what we've got here.
They just created an Uber for dogs.
That's awesome.
But it's a sharing ride with animals, because the Uber actually lets you take animals.
Okay.
Approve it, but you can request that someone comes walk your animal. Then they come to your location.
Uber, see, this is where the market is. I would never have thought of that, but there was a market need for it. Somebody responded to it. I'm going to make a quick note for the online folks here. Okay. All right. So back to the PowerPoint slideshow. So a quick note on graphing supply. Again, I don't want you to become experts on graphing. That's not the point. But the idea, what do we have here? We've got a positive relationship. That left and down red arrow that you see on the screen, that's an indication that every time there's a drop in price, there's also a drop in quantity supply. Likewise, a movement up on the curve is going to be associated with a movement to the right on the curve, showing that there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. So just as we had elasticity of demand, we also can ask ourselves by how much quantity supplied changes when price changes. And that's going to be elasticity. So remember, I told you elasticity is simply a fancy word for responsiveness. Price changes, quantity supply. Price goes up, quantity supply goes up. That much we know. By how much? And this is going to be an important one. So supply is elastic if a small change in price leads to a large change in quantity supply. So imagine, oh, this example is already too old. How many of you actually buy CDs? Okay, so some of you understand this. This is good. I'm always worried about this. So you remember the old Victrola 78 record players that we used to? Okay. A CD. If you think about it, a CD sells for somewhere around $15 to $20 ballpark. But how much does it cost to produce a marginal CD? It's what? A case that's made of plastic. It's got to cost what? 4 or 5 cents, maybe. Then you've got the actual CD itself. Now I don't do this anymore, but I used to go to Office Depot and I would buy 20 or 50 or 100 CDs for a few bucks. So again, a few extra marginal cents. A little bit of paper for the liner notes. A few cents worth of engraving, if that, recording the CD. And then you have a little bit of royalties. But it's really cheap. So you're a producer of CDs and there's a massive surge in demand for your CD. So let's say it's the new CD from who's a cool group these days. I don't even know. The Beatles come out with a new CD. Just kidding. Anyway, Jay-Z comes out with a new CD, and everybody wants it, and the demand goes up and the price goes up. It's going to be really easy for the record company to increase its quantity supplied in response to the price because it's so cheap to produce additional CDs, marginal CDs. Same thing with orange juice. If people suddenly decide they want a lot of orange juice, but they don't want to eat oranges anymore, it's really easy to convert the existing stock of oranges into orange juice. Now, on the other hand, supply is inelastic if a large change in price leads to a small change in the quantity supplied. Now, imagine doctors. So I get up tomorrow morning, I'm having my morning tea, and I read in the newspaper that salaries for doctors have gone up by 200% over the past few years because of regulatory changes. And I say, oh, good. I'm going to get an online class and I'm going to start being a doctor in January. No, I can't do that. It takes a long time to produce new doctors. In fact, after college, it takes, what, about 8 years worth of training to become a doctor? So, and loans and the long hours and the 12-hour shifts, et cetera. So even if there's a huge change, the wages of doctors go up by, say, 50%. You're not going to see a huge surge in doctors. You're going to see a small increase in the quantity supplied. Come from what? Retired doctors going back to work. Doctors who might be working as administrators who go back to work as doctors. part-time doctors who go work full-time. So you're going to see a small change in the quantity supply, but not huge. What's that, sorry? Doctors who get out of the military change in career. So instead of staying in the military, you go into the private sector. But that's not going to be huge. Unlike CDs, the marginal cost of a new doctor is really big. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's going to mean that this is a case when marginal inputs are expensive or production takes a lot of time. So I just mentioned doctors, computer engineers, et cetera. And then there's an extreme example, which is called perfect inelasticity. That means that no matter how much the price changes, there will not be any change in the quantity supply. So imagine Fayetteville State opens up a new Center for Public Policy and decides that it's going to hire a former US president to be the founding director of this institute. And it starts off and says, well, there are really very few former US presidents, right? There's like 4 or 5 living right now. Even if you increase the salary, what's that, sorry? Is it 5?
I think during the election, all 5.
Obama, Clinton, 2 Bushes, and Carter. Yep, 5. Even if you raise the salary to $1 million a year, $10 million a year, $30 million a year, there's still only 5 former US presidents. That's what's called inelastic, perfectly inelastic supply. Regardless of how much the price changes, that quantity supplied is going to be fixed. Now, that's relatively rare. That could be the case for natural resources. But even then, think about this for a second. After Hurricane Katrina destroyed, this is what, 12 or so years ago. What's that time? Yeah. And a major portion of the US oil refining infrastructure. That happened right around the time that China started getting wealthier and consuming more oil, and the price of oil shot up. What did we see over the past 10 years in oil production? One word, and it sounds almost like a bad word. I shouldn't say that. Sounds like a bad word.
Oh, I would know.
Fracking. Shale oil. Here's the thing. Shale oil, and I'm not going to get into the technology. I'm sure somebody here knows more about it than I do. Shale oil is a way of extracting oil sideways, involving pockets of natural gas. The bottom line is it's a lot more expensive. It's not worth extracting shale oil for less than about, if oil is at less than about $45, $50 a gallon. There's a barrel, sorry, there's an exact number. But what did the market do in response to the high oil prices? And we thought that supply was inelastic? No, the market simply deployed more expensive measures that were suddenly worth it because oil was more expensive and made a profit. And here's the interesting part. So many shale oil producers were successful that they brought up the supply of oil significantly enough that the price of oil started falling, and a lot of the smaller producers had to go out of business. That's just the nature of the beast. So something to keep in mind, some kinds of production that may be worth doing in certain market conditions, not going to be worth doing in other market conditions. So just say, again, I don't want to make you experts at graphing, but just so you get a sense, the steep curve, what does that indicate? Well, that a big change, vertical change in price is matched by a small horizontal change, and vice versa for elastic supply. And then I've got a perfectly inelastic curve there as an indication that no matter how high the price goes, that quantity supplied is going to stay absolutely fixed. And I'll close up with determinants of elasticity before I go back and check the chat board. What is going to determine elasticity? You've guessed it already, I'm sure. The price of marginal inputs. So depending on whether they're expensive or not, how easy is it going to be to produce more? That is, how easy is it going to be to increase the quantity supplied in response to a change in price? The time necessary to obtain other inputs. So if I see that there's a great opportunity in making sandwiches, there's a couple health permits I might need, maybe a few tax permits, got to find a building, but I could probably from right now get a sandwich shop up and running within about a month, is my guess. Maybe a little bit longer with the health permits, but that's my guess. On the other hand, what if I am in the electricity business and I see that the price of electricity's gone up? I'm going to open up a nuclear power plant next week? No, Takes a lot of time. You got all the federal permits, you got to get the engineers, safety permits, it's going to take a while to build it up, et cetera. So the time necessary to obtain the other inputs. And then finally, the time that the price change stays in effect. If the price of doctors, the wages of doctors go up briefly, we're not going to see much of an effect. But over time, more people are going to go into medical school over biology. Now, in fact, this is just another interesting tidbit. I don't have the exact figures, and this is the problem with trying to remember a bunch of small things, but the number of applicants every year to law schools is directly related to the average starting salary of lawyers. So there's a quick responsiveness. Now, of course, it takes 3 years to train a lawyer, 8 years to train a doctor. So we would imagine more responsiveness there, but there actually is more responsiveness there. Let me run over and check the chat.
Like the military bonuses and whatnot, it's like sometimes.
My girlfriend just graduated from Berkeley Law School,
Mhm.
and they're giving her a $45,000 a year salary after she gets done with it, just to keep their postgraduate salaries up and entice people to come. It's also shady.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah, so she doesn't have to work, right? But they advertise to their folks, hey, our graduates earn $170,000 a year. Come to our law school, but they fail to mention that 45,000 of that they're giving to each person to keep the
I'll repeat that for the online
salary
folks.
high.
Yeah. So the idea is that the law school is subsidizing, adding a portion on top of the salaries so that the figures look better, so that more people apply. Hey, this looks like a good law school.
Much more eloquently put, yes.
But I won't complain. Why are you complaining? Because you're getting it, right?
Well, I'm just thinking.
Yeah. In the end, you're getting it, but then you got to wonder, is that really what the law school's selling?
Yeah, she's taking over.
Well, any ideas what the average salary of a lawyer is in the U.S. ballpark? What is the average salary of lawyers in the U.S. roughly? Less. It's somewhere around $60,000 to $70,000 because for every
what kind of lawyer you are?
just anybody practicing law, because for everybody who's practicing law in a big corporate firm, you've got a little county lawyer, country lawyer, you've got a government lawyer, et cetera. So it's actually a lot lower than you might anticipate.
And you know what, like even teachers, I mean, they need to do something about, especially in North Carolina.
About teacher salaries?
Yeah. It's terrible.
Depending on what
That's-
county you're in.
I could also jump in and start, but I won't.
Like if you just compare it, North Carolina versus any other state is low, regardless of where you teach.
And
So,
then the rate of
yeah.
pay, I mean, the frequency of pay doesn't,
Exactly.
Let's see.
once a month.
I'm really curious about the economics of education, but if I start thinking about it or talking about it right now, I'm going to get super sidetracked. So let's talk about it some other time.
You can ask the doctoral students in the air leadership program.
Probably very happy, I'm sure. Any questions? Let's see. I've got a question from the chat, folks. 85. Yeah, that was about it. Courtney guessed it was about 85K. It might have gone up over the years, but it's that ballpark, 75, 80-ish. My guess would have been 150, 200,000 because you think, oh, lawyer making a lot of money. Some do, but a lot don't. All right, let's continue with the journey, as it were. So I'm trying not to keep it not too technical here.
I'm just curious,
Yes.
how, why is that?
Why is what? Sorry.
Why they get paid so low?
Lawyers?
Yeah.
Well, again, there's such a broad variety of what it means to. You could be a lawyer in a Wall Street financial firm practicing financial law 80 hours a week, or you could be a small town lawyer where you do 7 wills every week and 1 real estate transaction. You go home for lunch, and sometimes you don't have any work for 3 days because you're in a small town. So you get a broad variety, and then you get the private sector lawyers versus the nonprofit lawyers, government lawyers, etc. So, all right, basic theory of the firm. Those of you who are interested could take semester on theory of the firm. There are entire courses on theory of the firm. I'm going to try to dilute it into about 2 or 3 slides here. Actually, 1 slide before we go on to the rest. Out of simplicity, we're going to assume that the only motivation for business firms is profit. In the real world, we all know that's not true. Sometimes some people want to crush the competition. Some people are just out to have fun. Some people genuinely want to make the world a better place. I think, without having read details, some of the side things I've read, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were initially in it for the fun and to serve people. They wanted to provide better products because they just thought it was really cool. So much the better if they made a lot of money in the process. So what does a business firm do? And the simple answer is it takes inputs and transforms them into outputs. That's what a business firm does. And the fundamental test is going to be whether the business firm is adding value for the consumer. So as I've mentioned on the first day of class, it never hurts to repeat it, the computer that we see here, the cell phone that we see here, even the book, is utterly useless to you if the inputs have not been transformed into something useful. So what is a computer? It's a bunch of plastic, it's a bunch of circuitry, it's a bunch of knowledge. Some people had to write the code. If you were to put into a box for me some plastic, some circuitry, and a 500-page book on programming, that would be utterly useless for me. But if you, the entrepreneur, you, the manager, take all those things together and put them together in a way that serves the consumer, suddenly the consumer is willing to pay $500 or $1,000 for that exact same stuff that is suddenly useful to the consumer. So we're not going to get caught up with any of the with too much of the details, but I have one simple equation for you. That's simply that Q is a function of KL. That is, output is a function of capital and labor. That's the simplest way of thinking about it. So yeah, you're feeding in natural resources, and you have to have a recipe to pull it all together, and that's where you come in, you, the manager. And profit is going to be the signal. Profit is going to be the signal of the market telling you if you're doing a good job or a bad job of adding value for the consumer. And that's going to serve a really important function, because if you're not serving the consumer, the market's going to take away your resources in the form of bankruptcy. And bankruptcy is not a destruction of the resources. So it's not like, oh, company's going bankrupt, so what's a good company? Just Braniff Airlines, all the airlines seem to go bankrupt. They're not going to blow up all the planes and shoot all the workers and destroy the computers. That's not the way it goes. No, the planes get sold to somebody else who's going to try to compete in that market and add value. The workers get laid off, and it's painful for them. But in the greater picture market process, those workers are resources that get to go work somewhere else. So what a bankruptcy does is it takes resources away from entrepreneurs who have not been able to add value to them and frees them up to go work on something else. Now, it's painful for the individual involved, there's no doubt. But imagine if a law had been passed about 1850, 1860, 1870, saying farm machinery is illegal in the US because we want to preserve jobs in the agricultural sector. Well, at the time of the American founding, about 90% of the population was involved in farming in some sort. Today, it's less than 2%. Today, you've got 2% of the people feeding the other 98%. We could have protected all those jobs by making farm machinery illegal, but we'd all be starving. So if you think about it on the individual level, reorganization and bankruptcy in the discipline of the market is very painful for the entrepreneur who loses everything, for the worker who loses his job. But at the macro level, it's a very useful process. In fact, an economist once called it creative destruction. It's destruction, but it's creative because it allows the market to go forward. Typewriter markets, the farm laborer market, largely. I remember.
TV antennas.
What's that, sorry?
TV antennas.
TV antennas, not doing too well either. Think of the telephone market. It was always cool. Yeah, I'm going to get a cordless phone. Yeah, but you still have to dock it at the end of the day, and then you've got a 20-foot radius. But I remember back in the 80s, that was a cool thing.
Yeah.
You could get a cordless phone. And then my sister wanted a phone that had a 20-foot cord so she could walk around the entire room and talk to her friends for hours. But these things are utterly useless now. The market has spoken. So, all right. So let's continue with a few key concepts here. And I'm going to have, let's see, 2 more slides, and then we'll take a break. I think that'll take us roughly to about, no, let's continue a little bit beyond that unless I'm not sensing I'm not reading diminishing marginal returns in your eyes yet. So let's continue. It's so great to be able to make that kind of joke with you guys now.
Yeah.
I love it. All right. So one reminder here is accounting versus economic profit. And I have it written down here, so I'm not gonna ask you what it is, but the big difference is opportunity cost. And so this is really important here. If I own a building and I'm running a building and I have $100,000 worth of expenses and $200,000 worth of revenue, the accountants are going to tell me that I'm making how much per year? 100,000. That's my accounting profit. But an economist is going to look at that and say, wait a minute, what is your opportunity cost? If you could be renting out that building for $200,000 a year, you're losing $100,000 a year based on your opportunity cost. So you're running an economic loss. And that would basically, that saying is that you can be running an accounting profit, but your resources are not earning as much as they could somewhere else. So one of you, for example, you graduate, you go get a job for a bank, and you're really excited because you're making $150,000 a year working for a bank. That's an accounting profit. What if you could be working for yourself and making $200,000 a year? Now, separate and apart from that, maybe you don't want to work for yourself. Maybe you don't want to take the risk. Part of working for somebody else is passing the burden of the risk. So if you think about the difference between what a first year, even let's say in a big law firm, a first year attorney might be making $120,000 a year in a big city and bringing in $200,000 or $300,000 a year worth of business and legal work for the company. What does the difference mean? The difference basically means the lawyer doesn't have to pay for insurance. It doesn't have to find clients. It doesn't have to pay for a building. It doesn't have to pay for internet. It doesn't have to pay for all the legal fees and subscriptions. It doesn't have to pay the bar fees. And most important, if there's a quiet week where there's no work, the lawyer still gets paid. Whereas an independent lawyer is going to run the risk. So that's something you're going to have to think about is what you prefer. But back to accounting profit, you can make an accounting profit and an economic loss. That is, even if your accountant's happy with you and your revenue is greater than your cost, if you're not meeting your opportunity cost, then you're making an economic loss. Which is why, and this is the really weird concept that we're going to look at later tonight and going into next week, normal economic profit is zero. Normal economic profit is zero. That doesn't mean that you're losing money. It simply means that your resources are earning their opportunity costs. They're earning as much as they could somewhere else. Now, within that, you could have a $5 a year accounting cost because you're not really good at what you do, and you could have $1 million a year accounting profit. Sorry. But the economic profit, normal terms, economic profit is zero. If you have a positive economic profit, what does that mean? It's possible, but rare. If you have a positive economic profit, what does that mean? Well, it simply means that you and your resources are earning more than your opportunity cost. And what do you think is going to happen with competitors? They're going to jump in the market and compete with you and bid your economic profit back down to zero. So you could be making, still everybody can make an accounting profit, that's possible, but the market's always going to tend back towards a zero economic profit because that simply means that resources are earning what they could be earning somewhere else. Tied in with that, we've talked a little bit about sunk cost, but it's important to mention that again. Sunk cost means, the sunk cost fallacy in economics means that you should ignore the past cost and look at your opportunity cost today. Two examples. One, I pay $100 a year for a newspaper subscription. I'm really busy running around, making money, managing my company, growing the company, and I think to myself, you know, I paid $100, so I really should read it. An economist will tell you no. That $100 in the past is irrelevant. What matters is your opportunity cost now. And if reading the newspaper takes time away from growing your business, don't do it. Likewise, there's a couple examples in the textbook. You buy $10,000 worth of iron, and using that, you expect that you can make $15,000 worth of steel parts. Well, suddenly the price of iron goes up and your iron is worth $20,000. Ignore the fact, ignore the price at which you bought it. look at your situation today. What is your opportunity cost? Sell the iron. You'll make more money. Then we have a definition that's important here. The difference between the short run and the long run. Now, in some ways, this may seem a little bit of an arbitrary distinction, but it's actually a very important one, and here's why. There are two conditions. In the short run, a firm cannot change its plant size. That means capital is fixed. And that kind of makes sense, right? So let's say I own a sandwich shop, and there's a surge of people coming in, and I know that I need to make more sandwiches. I can hire 10 more workers pretty much like that. But I can't just double the size of my shop overnight. The second condition for the short run is that no other businesses have time to enter or exit the market. Over the long run, anybody could enter or exit the market. There are always potential competitors if there's money to be made. But you can't just say, oh, well, it's 7:30 a.m., I'm having my Cheerios, I'm reading today that there's a lot of money to be made in making semiconductors, so call up my buddy and say, okay, let's open up a semiconductor company, we start business at 9 o'clock. It's not gonna happen. So there's gonna be some time involved. So the two distinctions again, in the short run, a firm, the size of the plant is fixed, only labor is variable. In the long run, both labor and capital can be changed. Second condition, in the short run, nobody can enter or exit the market, but in the long run, others can enter or exit the market, which means that even if you're the only company competing in a market, you still need to keep in mind potential competitors in the long run. And there's no clear definition. My undergrads always ask me, how long is the long run or the short run? Is it 6 months? Is it 1 year? Well, it really depends on the industry. So again, taking these two extreme examples, I could probably get a sandwich shop up and running within a month. So my long run for a sandwich shop is going to be a month. Within that first month, I really can't expand my operations into a new building because it's going to take some time to get the real estate transaction going. It's going to take some time to get the permits to get started, but a month seems reasonable. On the other hand, a nuclear power plant, the long run could be 10 years. So it's really going to depend on which industry we're talking about here. Let me pop over and take a look at the chat board, see if we've got anything. Okay. Back to PowerPoint. All right. Two more concepts, and then we get to the really fun stuff. First concept is economies of scale. Now, economies of scale simply means that you might actually be better off producing at a higher size than a smaller size. Now, here's a simple example. Let's say you open up a business that carries pianos, and you work alone. How many pianos are you going to carry every day as one person? None. You hire 2 people. How many pianos are you going to be able to carry? Probably none. 3 people, you might be able to carry 1 or 2 per day. Suddenly, if you get 10 people into the business, you're able to carry not just 1 or 2 pianos a day, but you might be able to even carry 20 or 30 pianos a day. You have economies of scale. That is, it's actually going to be cheaper for you per piano because you've got a lot more people involved. Now, you can also get diseconomies of scale. Now, here's an example that I use. There's not enough of you here, plus you're serious MBA students. For my undergraduates, I've got a game with tennis balls. And I have about 30 tennis balls, and I place 1 box at the side of one of the room, and another box at the other side of the room. And the job, this is a really simple business. The business carries tennis balls from one box to the other box. And the rules are simple. Every worker has to touch each tennis ball once. And the second rule is anyone that falls is broken. So what I do is I write on the board the number of workers and the total number of tennis balls that they carry within 30 seconds. So you get the first student running back and forth, running out of breath, panting, sweating, etc. You get a second student involved, production goes up. In fact, the second student adds more than the first did. You have a third student come in, And then they start getting more efficient. They might toss the tennis balls to each other. And then the third student is adding on more tennis balls than the second student added, increasing marginal returns. And then eventually what I do is I have 10 students. Remember the rule is everybody's got to touch the tennis ball. 15 students, 30 students, 50 students. And what happens when you have 50 students trying to do this? Chaos ensues. That means that they've got diminishing marginal returns. They've got too many people doing this. So that's an example right there of first increasing marginal returns. Each additional student adds more than the one before did because they're able to help each other out. Eventually it flattens out, and then eventually you start getting negative marginal returns where each additional student actually hurts the process because they're bumping into each other. So you can think about that with a car company. You're not going to go into business and make and sell 100 cars per year. It doesn't make sense in the car industry. The only way you're going to be able to compete in the car industry is if you have large assembly plants, huge numbers of workers specializing in different fields, engineers working on different processes, supply chains, etc. So it would be like opening up an airline and you're going to have 2 planes. Doesn't work. On the other hand, imagine selling a few thousand Big Macs per year. The whole concept of McDonald's is what? Billions and billions served. That's economies of scale. McDonald's has its distribution routes. It's got the brand immediately, so McDonald's really doesn't have to do that much. Yeah, it wants to take business away from Burger King, but who in America today has never heard of McDonald's? Automatically, when you open up a McDonald's franchise, you have the advertising taken care of, the reputation's taken care of. Now, on the other hand, it wouldn't really make sense. So let's say we're looking at education, and I say, well, you know, the seminar model works really well. 10 students around a table, we have a discussion, a lot of writing. Let's have a 1,000-student seminar because the model works so well. That wouldn't work. That's called diseconomies of scale. So one of the things as managers that you're going to have to think about is, what is the optimal size of your plant? What is the optimal size of your company? And I say this as a cautionary warning. It's going to depend on the industry. I apologize for this. I have to be behind the computer for the camera, but it's kind of weird looking at you over the screen. What is the optimal size? And a lot of people, I think, just have the reflex, bigger, bigger, bigger all the time. Now, some cases it makes sense because you got economies of scale, which means you're able to produce more units for cheaper. But in a lot of cases, things get too big. You lose your identity. You get diseconomies of scale. Suddenly, the managers aren't aware of what's going on. Suddenly, the company gets too big and too bureaucratic and too clunky. And you see that. So in terms of the market, that kind of works, though, because you have an innovator in initial stages of production. Innovator becomes a big company, but a lot of times the big company gets so clunky and bureaucratic. And we saw this. What's that, sorry?
Google and Alphabet.
Google, exactly. So I'm wondering how long Google's going to be able to stay limber and responsive, or if somebody else is going to take over Google because Google's gotten too big.
No, I mean, they created Alphabet, the umbrella.
Oh, the umbrella company.
So they can break into several smaller companies because it's too.
Boom, good management decision. Instead of getting too big, you farm off your operations for other things, then you can still have the benefits of having parallel companies, but you're a separate structure. I saw this with my past 2 universities ago in Florida, Florida Gulf Coast University. It started out with the whole principle that it was going to be in the 1990s. It was going to embrace technology in the classroom. It was going to be an innovative place for teaching. It was going to be a friendly place. And then over the next 15 or 20 years, the population exploded in Southwest Florida because so many people were retiring there. And then I was only there for about 4 years, but friends who had been there almost 20 years said that that was the initial founding model, and they had maybe 3,000 or 4,000 students when they opened. They expanded to 10,000 and then eventually to 15,000 students, and they said it completely changed the identity of the place. Classes went from about 25 students to 90 students. Many things started to get streamlined, so there was even this notion that there was a common textbook for different sections. So if you had 10 sections of principles of economics, you would have 1 textbook for all the classes instead of letting the professor choose. You would have common syllabi, so everybody took the exam on the same day. A lot more assessment work and accreditation. And the faculty said it completely changed the identity of the place because it started out with a particular educational mission in mind of using technology and having professors be innovators. And then the bureaucracy started to grow and the nature of the place changed completely. So one of the things that you'll have to think about as managers is what is the optimal size of your company? Now, if you're underneath, and there's a technical and graphical way to look at this, and we'll look at that really briefly, but just to think about it, if you're underneath the optimal size, you want to grow to achieve economies of scale, and it makes more sense. But there comes a point where you're getting too big, and you're going to get diseconomies of scale. So as a manager, you're going to have to know the identity of your company in addition to knowing the cost, and then that's when you can start thinking about, are you a service organization where it makes sense to have really close contact between the actual individuals? So think of the small businesses where you work, or I'm going to say it again, your favorite bartender. You might be one person away from the manager. In fact, you might know the manager at your local grocery store. And if there's a problem, you talk to the produce manager, you can talk to the general manager. But if a company gets too big, then the consumer is going to be 12 steps away from the manager, and there's going to be less responsiveness. So there's a trade-off to be had between the two. While I'm on the subject of that, one of my pet peeves, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I hate automatic answering services where I have to press 3 and then 9 and 17 and then 4, and then eventually you've pressed an incorrect answer. Goodbye. So I have to call again. Now, I understand exactly what the company's doing. It's saving a lot of money through automation, but it also has to make the decision saving money versus being responsive. One of the things I love, there's still a few small businesses, like my insurance company, I get a human being every single time. And then I'll even get questions at some point. So, hey, how's your dog doing? I've lost my dog since, but that doesn't matter. Hey, we just walked by your house the other day. It's looking good. And then you get that personal contact. Now, that's a trade-off because you're spending more money rather than having a machine filter the calls. Then you can also have different tiers, but we'll talk about that 2 lectures from now. So I travel enough with Delta Airlines that I get a human being every time. And I've got a special number that I can call, and they'll make reservations for me, and they'll change my tickets, and they're actually nice to me. As opposed to other airlines where here I'm still waiting on the phone, put it on speakerphone, go do something else, etc. So things to think about. All right, next concept we've got is similar to this. It's the concept of changing marginal returns. So each worker is going to make a different contribution compared to the other worker, not because of identity, better workers versus worse workers, but even if you take 100 equal workers, they're all just as good, they're all just as trained. Each worker is going to have a different impact on the production based on the number that person has. So in the case of the tennis balls, right? The first worker obviously is going to be better than 0, and tennis balls just sort of hanging out there. But typically the 4th and 5th workers are each going to add more to the total production than the second one is because people can cooperate. But eventually, each worker is going to have a positive impact, but falling because it's less important. So think you're running a sandwich shop. You're running the local Subway. And it's 9 o'clock in the morning and your 2 colleagues have just called in sick. So you're alone. You open the door. You're alone slicing the meats and the vegetables. You're alone making the sandwiches. Then you've got to run over to the cash register. Then there's a problem with the front door that you've got to go run over and take care of. You're running back and forth and a kid spills something. A second person comes in, you can breathe a little bit more easily because that second person is going to help you a lot. And a third person comes in, well, now you can have 2 people making sandwiches and 1 person running the cash register. Life is good. A 4th person comes in, that's nice, you're helpful, thank you, but not as helpful as that 3rd person was. 5th and 6th person come in, you can have somebody clearing tables, somebody taking care of running interference with customers. Still a positive contribution, but much smaller marginal contribution. And then eventually people start, imagine, I've heard there's a fraternity or sorority benefit where they had 20 people behind the counter at Subway making sandwiches. They were bumping into each other, completely inefficient. That's negative marginal returns. So one thing to consider is that each worker Not because of identity, but because of the place in the production process. Each worker is going to have a different marginal impact. The flip side of that is that we're going to have changing marginal costs. So how do you think of that? Let's say that your industry is reading books. Kind of is, your students. So your marginal product is going to be how many pages you read per minute. The marginal cost is how many minutes it takes to read a page. So when you sit down and study, you're still thinking about your stupid roommate, you're thinking about your bills, you're thinking about your kids, you're kind of distracted. You're going to get initially increasing marginal product. Each minute you're going to read more and more as you get focused. But as you get tired, your marginal product's going to start falling. You're still productive, and then after about 6 hours, you read the same thing again and again. You read the same paragraph, your eyes are glazing over. That's negative marginal product. The flip side of that is the marginal cost. So when you start reading, it's going to take you a fair amount of time to read each page because you're still distracted by all your other responsibilities. Eventually, your marginal cost is going to start falling. It takes less and less time to read a page. You're on a roll. You've been studying for an hour. You're focused, you're on a roll. The marginal cost of reading that next page is pretty small. As you get tired, the marginal cost of reading a page is going to increase. It's going to take more and more time. So you can think of marginal cost as the flip side of marginal product. And with that in mind, it's 7:05, so we're going to go ahead and take let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. I'm going to pause the recording here, and then I'll take any questions from the synchronous students online. So we'll meet again at 7:15. We are resuming recording. We're going to go back. So, there we go. So I just want to make a repeat announcement that I've made before. I want to reiterate my apologies for the tech problems that we've been having. I think they're resolved. We're going to see at the end of this class. We're trying a couple different things of how to record, where to store the recording. I should be able to post the recording immediately after class tonight. I have found over the years that students fundamentally care about two things, and that is the content and the grade, in differing degrees, of course. So the content, I can assure you that in spite of the technical troubles we've been having, all the content is posted, and you can always ask me questions. And then on the grade side of things, I am aware of the difficulties that we've been having, and that will not be held against you because it's ultimately my fault. I'm the end user here. I'm the I think the expression might be I'm the residual claimant on this one. It's my course. I'll take responsibility for it. If you got any questions or concerns, send me an email, let me know, but I'll clean up. And then the third thing is that for a variety of reasons, one of the regulatory and structural, I'm still sharing the course with Dr. Janssen, and he's handling all the homework stuff. He's handling the grading of the homework. He knows Excel a lot better than I do. I'm going to change the structure of the homework for next semester when I teach this class again. So there's still a little bit of uncertainty in terms of who answers the question. We're working through all of that. Apologies. Come see me or come see Dr. Janssen electronically or in person if you've got any questions. We'll get you through it. So, and then the other thing is, life is full of trade-offs. I'm an economist. I study trade-offs in addition to living them. And as much as possible, I'm trying to make this class relevant for managerial questions. Now, some of the material doesn't lend itself directly to that. It's theoretical material, and so what I'm trying to do is, as much as possible, cut out the stuff that's too theoretical that we don't need, and as much as possible, explain to you why this theoretical thing can actually be really relevant to you as a manager. So you're not going to be sitting in your office 10 years from now, pulling out a piece of paper and drawing a graph, but the insight from the graph that you're going to get is the kind of thing that you can use in terms of your production. So I'm intentionally cutting some corners, cutting out some material, trying to keep this as relevant as possible as we move forward.
I wish someone would come and take that page.
Well, this is the first time I've taught an MBA class. So before I taught this, I had a long conversation with a friend who's been teaching MBAs for 15, 20 years and asked him basically the big picture question, not the material in the class. What does an MBA student want? He's going to say they're going to be hardworking, they're going to be interested, and they're going to be practical. And I come from a world that is absolutely not practical. I talk about theory, I look about big picture processes, etc. So I'm trying to bring this all practical, practical, practical. What will you need as a manager? And so again, it's not about the details and the technical stuff, because there are data analytics. That's going to be a more technical class. A tax accounting class. That you need to know your stuff. You can't just say to the IRS, well, you know, I got the general theory of what you want, but I'm not going to pay you really what I'm supposed to pay. No, that's not good. But as an economist, my sense is that what you need out of this class is the big picture analysis, how to think like an economist, how to think in terms of opportunity cost, how to think in terms of margins. That's really what I'm going for this class. So back to, yes?
Are you friends with Dr. Brad, who teaches business government, right?
Dr. Brett? I have not.
Because there's the third week that he's brought up an example. You were in the bathroom, you said that. This is the third week he's brought up an example that is directly correlated with case studies. We were talking about alcohol earlier.
I've never met Dr. Brett.
3 times, like our paper for that week, and we talked about it.
Could all of them be just.
We all sit around bars talking about alcohol? No, not true. I have not met this professor, so that's
Then you have to let me.
coincidence.
Never mind.
I'm gonna call it coincidence. Okay, so I have a fun graph for you guys here. Yay! It's a little complicated, but I'm gonna break it down for you because it's actually really simple. On the top, we have total product, and this is for, every company is gonna be slightly different, but this is a representative case. On the top, we have total product. Then on the bottom curve, we've got marginal product and average product. That's the big picture. I'm now gonna step back and break things down for you. So the total product is just a fancy name for quantity. How many sandwiches did you make today? How many cars did you make last year? That's your total product. The second concept that we have is marginal product. Well, you all know what marginal means. It means one additional unit. So in other words, because we're operating in the short run, what is fixed and what can be changed in the short run? Can you change the size of your factory in the short run? No. So the capital is fixed. So this is going to make things super simple. The marginal product is simply how much more the next worker is producing. What is the marginal increase in total product from one more worker? And for those of you who want to, this is not part of the class itself, but I just want to have it there. It's the derivative of quantity with respect to labor. That is, if you add one more unit of labor, how much is your quantity going to change? That's your marginal product. Add one more worker. What about the 7th worker? How much is the 7th worker adding to total production? What about the 75th worker? How much is the 75th worker adding? And then the final we've got is the average product, because we're going to run into a slight complication. Each worker is bringing a slightly different amount to total product. Again, because of how workers are able to help each other, increasing then decreasing marginal returns. That means, of course, that each product is going to have a different marginal cost. Just as I talked about, you sit down and you read. If you sit down and you read, each page is going to have a different marginal cost in time. So when we're trying to calculate profit later on, it's going to be really complicated because each unit has a different marginal cost. So what we're going to be interested in is the average cost of production at different levels, because they're going to even each other out. The first unit might be super expensive because you've got one harried worker with his hair on fire running around trying to take care of things. That's going to be super expensive. And then the 75th sandwich of the day might be actually really cheap. But you want to know on average how much it costs you, and then you're going to be able to calculate your profit. So because we want to know average cost, we want to know average product. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take these 3 portions of the graph and break them down for you into individual parts. The first one, I have to say I love it. It's the coolest one. Marginal thinking. You know, if I were to, I actually have friends who have economics tattoos, like graphs on their arms, because they're nerds and I'm not really. So we have here a marginal product curve. And we said in the short run, the size of the company is fixed, the size of the firm, the plant is fixed. So marginal product is going to be the extra output from one worker. So as we go through this, think of the example of the sandwich shop I told about, or the piano. In the beginning, as you add more and more workers, they're able to help each other out, and they can divide their labor. So in the beginning, each worker makes a slightly bigger contribution than the worker before that. Alone, I might be able to make 3 sandwiches, for the sake of argument, an hour. Put in a second worker, and together we can make 8. That means that the second worker just contributed 5 sandwiches. The third worker might contribute 7, as we have 1 person at the cash register, 2 people making sandwiches. The fourth worker might contribute 10 because that person is in the back slicing tomatoes so that we don't have to stop the production. But eventually you add on another worker. Yeah, that's nice, thank you. Each worker is making a positive contribution, but it's smaller and smaller and smaller. Maybe a second sandwich per hour, maybe 1. And then eventually you crowd each other out, you start detracting, you start bumping into each other, spilling things, your total product goes down. So what does that mean in terms of the curve? Well, if marginal product's increasing in the beginning, from learning and efficiency, from cooperation, that means we have increasing marginal returns. The red curve is going up in the beginning. Eventually, we're still above 0, but each additional worker is adding less and less. Total product is still growing, you're still producing more sandwiches, but that fourth worker who is adding an 8th sandwich, maybe the 10th worker is adding 4 sandwiches, then 3 for the 11th and 2 for the 12th. So it's still positive, but marginal product is falling. Each additional worker is contributing less. Then eventually, you cross that 0 line. Each worker is actually taking away from the process. Get away from me, let me work. So, I have an economist who was, professor who was talking about this. He would rake leaves. I haven't been in North Carolina long enough. I suspect leaf raking in the fall is a big activity. And he said his daughter, when she was about 5 years old, had her little rake, and she would come out and help, and he would just roll his eyes and say, please don't help me. She's having fun, but she's just destroying everything. You know, she's trying to help, and she's pushing stuff all over the place. And go play somewhere else, right? So, not as a parenting moment, but in terms of production, his daughter's marginal product was negative. She was getting in his way. Here, go do something else. Well, that in the graph is simply the point where that red line crosses the horizontal axis, crosses the axis, and starts falling. That means that each individual worker is actually taking away from the production. Next, we're going to look at the relationship, and I've already been talking about this, but I find that visualizing it with a graph and talking about it at the same time is a good way to talk about things. We talked about how the first and second and third worker are each adding more and more. What does that do to total production? Well, we see that there's a relationship here, and we have basically 3 different points, where you see point 0 to point K. That's increasing marginal returns. That means that the total product, the output, is increasing at an increasing rate. You're producing more sandwiches, and you're producing more and more as each additional worker is added on. Between point K and point L, which is the equivalent of point A and point B, each additional worker is still adding to the total number of sandwiches, but less and less. Marginal product is falling. The total output is increasing at a decreasing rate. For those of you who have had calculus, the first derivative is constantly positive, but between 0 and A, the second derivative is positive. Between A and B, the second derivative is negative, increasing at a decreasing rate. Now, what happens at point L? Point L, you hit the negative marginal returns. Each worker is taking away from the total output because they're bumping into each other. Spoilage, you're spilling, you turn around, you bump into somebody, 3 sandwiches fall, send them home. Why? Negative marginal returns means that your total product is actually going to start falling. That's what we see at point B. The total product actually is starting to fall. So I've just got the explanation there. You can look at it at home because I just walked through it. When marginal product is increasing, total product's increasing. When marginal product is positive but falling, total product is increasing at a decreasing rate. At the point where marginal product hits 0 and becomes negative, total output starts to fall. So that's a summary of the output, and I've got it here for your, when you go home and look at the, where are we? Oh, I haven't talked about the average yet. Never mind. Okay, so we've covered the marginal part. Now we're interested in the averages. And I have found that the best way to think about averages is to think about your GPA. What is your GPA? Hint, grade, point, average. What is your marginal contribution to that? Each class, or if you want to take it as a package, each semester. So, if your classes this semester are higher than your GPA is going to rise. If your classes next semester are lower than your GPA is going to fall. So another way of looking at that is if marginal product, which is red here, is above the average is rising. And at the point where marginal product falls below the average starts to fall. The only difference here, which is an important one, is that we know what the marginal product curve looks like for a company. It starts going up as workers get more efficient, and eventually it falls. It's kind of predetermined in a sense, just because of the nature of production. Your grades are not. That's the only difference. So you don't, you work harder one semester, you can bring your GPA up. You work less semester because you've got other work obligations, your GPA falls. So there's nothing predetermined. The good news here is that we already know what the marginal product curve looks like. It starts up positive, then it starts to fall. That means that we know that the average product curve, average product per worker, is going to rise and rise and rise because marginal is higher than it. And at the point where the two are equal and marginal falls below the average, then it's going to start dragging down the average product. So again, just think of it in terms of your GPA. Questions from the classroom? I'm going to switch over to see if there are any questions from the chat. Nope, everybody in the chat has fallen asleep. Just kidding, just kidding.
Yeah, they're already sensitive.
What's that, sorry?
They're already sensitive to the technology.
I know, I shouldn't joke about that. But I think they're fixed. And, I'm going to buy a nice thank you present for the IT guy who helped out with that. Okay, so we figured out the product. And this is the last few steps of what we need to do here. Now we're interested in cost. Now, one of the things that you'll figure out as managers and teachers, if you haven't already, different people have different styles. I like to know why I'm learning something. Tell me why it's relevant. Tell me where we're going with it. I've had classes in the past where people just sort of jump in with something and I'm supposed to figure out what's going on. So I tried to do a little bit of both because some people like to have all the details building up to something. Others like to know the big picture and then fill in the details as we go along. So I think I saw a chat request here, so I'm going to stop for a second and look at that. Let me take that question at the end of the class. So there's a question about I'm going to cover any of the homework problems. So go back here. We're interested in the cost of production. And here's the first question. Why are we interested in it? Well, here's why it matters. The first thing that we're going to see is if you step away for a moment from all the cost curves and the product, et cetera, and we go back to our first question on the first night, marginalism. Where is the business firm going to set production to maximize profit? And the answer is going to have to do with marginalism. And we'll come back to it in greater detail, but the answer is simply a firm is going to set production at the point where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue. Okay, what does that mean in plain English? It simply means that for a firm, it's going to look at its current level of production and ask, how much is it going to cost me to produce one more unit? And how much am I going to get from one more unit? And if you say to yourself, well, I could produce one more unit for $5 and get $7 from it, I should increase my production. On the other hand, if you look at your production and you say, I could produce one more unit for $9 and sell it for $7, I'm not going to do that. So if you're at a point where your marginal cost of production is less than your marginal revenue, you're losing. You're not exploiting your opportunities as well as you could, so you have to increase your production. If you're at the point where the marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue, you're losing money on every unit. So the business firm is going to try to produce at exactly the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So because of that, we need to know what marginal cost is. That's why we're going to look at that next. The second thing is, this is the complication I pointed out. Go ahead.
Breaking even?
It is breaking even, but think about this. First of all, we have to remember what the opportunity cost is. Second of all, if you're underproducing, you're leaving money on the table. So you don't want to underproduce. If you're overproducing, you're losing money also. Remember, it's the marginal cost. That's why we have the difference between marginal and average. So you want to produce exactly at the point where that last unit is bringing in as much as it's costing you. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. You're breaking even on the last unit. But remember, each unit has a different price of production.
For
Exactly.
profit. So that's
Exactly. That's why we also want to know the averages. So here's the complication. Oh, is that a question? So no, that's not. The complication here comes from the fact that each unit has a different cost of production. In the beginning, the cost is going to be high. Then the cost for each unit is going to fall. Then the cost is going to rise. So how are you possibly going to calculate how much money you're actually making and what your cost is with each different unit having a different marginal cost? And the answer to that is that we're going to look at averages. Averages are going to allow us to determine how much the firm as a whole, on a day, at the end of the day, you made 100 sandwiches. One of the sandwiches may have cost you $12 to make, another one may have cost you $1 to make, but what you're really interested in is the average, because then you're going to calculate how much your total cost of production was, and then you're going to be able to calculate how much money you brought in. We'll look at that in greater detail. But the way we're going to look at that is sneak preview. The definition of profit is total revenue minus total cost. Pretty simple, right? How much money did you bring in and what was your cost? Well, the total revenue is really easy to calculate. If you sell 10 sandwiches at $10 per sandwich, $100. If you sell 1,000 cars at $100,000 per car, that's going to be $1 million. I know that's a pretty expensive car. But the simple way that you calculate total revenue, price times quantity. How many did you sell? How much did you sell each one for? That's easy. So if each unit has a different cost, we're going to need to find the average, and here's where the average total cost comes in. The total cost is simply going to be equal to the average total cost multiplied by the quantity. Why is that? Mathematically speaking, we know that the average total cost is equal to total cost divided by quantity. Flip the quantity around, and we're going to be able, from our production schedule, to tell how many we had. So on average, we had 100 sandwiches, and our total cost that day was, say for the sake of argument, $20 of production. So the total average total cost per sandwich was going to be $5, even if some cost more and some cost less. Now we know the average. Now we're able to calculate the total cost because each sandwich had a different cost, and then we can balance that out with the revenue. That's just a sneak preview. I'm going to back up now and look at it. So I think there's a... Okay, so that was the same question. Yes, I'll address the question about the homeworks afterwards. So that's why it matters. So we continue here with a few key concepts in cost, and just we have 9 more slides. Each one has one concept. This could be crunched up into about 3 slides. I've broadened it to 9 just to give you a sense of where we are. The first cost that we have is total fixed cost. Total fixed cost is the cost that you have regardless of output. So the example here is you decide you're going to be an Uber driver. So you buy yourself a new car for $20,000 and you've got a monthly car payment, you've got an insurance payment, and you rent a garage. If you never drive your Uber car, you still have to pay the car payment, and you still have to pay the insurance, and you still have to pay the rental in your garage. That is your total fixed cost. Regardless of whether you drive 10 hours a day or 0 hours a day, your total fixed cost is going to stay exactly the same, even if you shut down your operation. Total variable cost is the cost of production. Variable, why? Because it varies. That is, you buy your car, ignore the fixed cost. If you drive 100 miles a day, your cost of business is going to be higher than if you drive 10 miles a day. The more you drive, the more gas you're going to need, the more wear and tear, but that's the variable cost. Put the two together, the total fixed cost, the cost of insurance, the car payment, etc., plus the cost of doing business, which is the variable cost, that's going to be your total cost of operation. So the two are going to be important. Again, I'm trying to stay away from too much technique. The total cost is going to be a combination of the total fixed cost plus the total variable cost. Now let's go back to our friend variable cost. We've seen that each unit has a different cost of production. Some are more expensive than others because workers get more efficient and they start crowding each other out. So we're going to have to ask ourselves, how much does each unit cost to produce? And that's just another way of saying, what does the marginal cost curve look like? That is, as you add more and more workers, what is the cost per unit looking like? Sneak preview, initially increasing marginal returns, then diminishing. Flip that on its side, that means that you have initially diminishing marginal cost. As your workers get more and more efficient, it's going to be cheaper and cheaper to produce one more unit, and then it's going to get more expensive. We'll graph it in a moment. Just wanted to go through it verbally. Now we're going to talk about the averages. So you notice I'm doing this intentionally. I'm telling the little sandwich shop story, then I'm coming back to the verbal explanation, then back to the sandwich shop, then back to the graphs. I'm saying the same thing 3 times. Repetition, different angles on it. Some of you are probably sitting here thinking, yeah, I got it the first time. Others are thinking, thanks for saying it several times. So we know that each unit has a different cost of production, different marginal cost depending on how many workers you've been adding. So we want to know what the averages look like. So the first average that we're going to talk about is the average fixed cost. And here's the important managerial lesson for you. Average fixed cost is going to fall because it's a fixed number divided by an increasing quantity. You buy a car for Uber. Your insurance plus your car payment amounts to $500 per month. I just made that up. If you drive 1 mile, your average fixed cost is going to be $500 for 1 mile. If you drive 500 miles, your average fixed cost is going to be $500 for 500 miles. That means your average fixed cost is going to fall as you produce more and more. And this is an important lesson for you as managers and as students. So if I spend 20 hours preparing a speech that I give at a college and I give it once, my preparation time costs me 20 hours. But if I give that speech twice, my preparation time is 10 hours. If I give the speech 20 times, it's 1 hour. That's not cheating. If somebody calls me up and says, hey, can you give that talk that you gave before, but our students have never heard it? And I think, yeah, I can. I'm going to print out the PowerPoint. I'm going to spend 10 minutes adding a few things here and there, but I'm not going to spend 20 hours fixing it. Done. This is why I always encourage my students when relevant, if you can write 2 papers on the same topic in the same semester, do it, because you're diminishing your average fixed cost. You've already done all the research. You've become an expert in one thing. Might as well write 2 papers on it. In fact, what I tell them also is if the other professor agrees, don't waste your time writing 2 papers. Write 1 bigger paper. You've already become an expert. Diminish your average fixed cost. Once you know how to do something, now balance that with some cost, of course. So let's say I write a speech. I've given it 10 times. Somebody wants to pay me more to give another kind of speech. Yeah, sure, I'll do that. But if I can get 5 or 10 talks paid out of the same speech that I've prepared, it makes perfect sense for me to do it. So same principle applies for you as managers, as students. Once you've figured out something, let your average fixed cost follow. Use economics for better living. Go ahead.
Yeah, she did that.
So let's jump over here and look at this graphically. So one way you could do this is look at a marginal product curve and stand on your head. But I don't recommend that. We know, right, each worker, in the beginning, each worker adds more and more compared to the worker before that, and then eventually it starts falling. That's like saying that for every hour of work, you're able to read more and more, and then less and less. Flip that around. Your cost per unit is going to fall initially, and then it's going to rise. So as you add more and more workers starting with 0, the costs are going to fall per unit, and then eventually the costs are going to rise. That is why the marginal cost curve is U-shaped. And we've got the same principle. Remember your GPA and your grades this semester. So if your GPA, if your grades this semester are higher than your GPA, they're going to pull the GPA up. The same thing happens with marginal cost. As marginal cost, which we know is a U-shape, you start off, marginal cost is going to be below the average total cost, so the average total cost is going to be falling, until the point where the marginal cost gets bigger than the average total cost, and then it's going to start dragging up the average. So in the beginning, it's going to be super expensive to produce that first sandwich, because that first sandwich, on average, contains all of your insurance payments, all of your electricity payments, all of your machine payments, and then that's going to start falling and falling and falling. But then eventually the marginal cost is going to rise as you hit diminishing marginal returns. And so the average total cost curve is going to be U-shaped. And that's basically just what I explained. So we can skip that. Put it there again. I'll let you look at that. I just explained this also. So we can put them all together now. And we have a nice rainbow of pretty colors here. Really, okay. So here you've got your explanation of the different costs. What do you really need? What's that, sorry? Okay, what do you really need to take away from this? First thing you need to take away from this is each unit has a different cost of production. That we know, because each worker is going to be more or less effective depending on how many workers you have. That means that the marginal cost is going to fall, and then it's going to increase. Second thing to keep in mind, the average fixed cost is going to start really high and then fall very quickly, because on average, that first unit contains all of the fixed payments, all the rent payments, all the car payments, all the insurance payments, and then that's going to fall very quickly. Use that to your advantage. Once you've set it up, on average, the more you produce, your fixed costs are going to fall. The third thing to keep in mind is that your average total cost is going to be U-shaped. Average total cost is going to start high because that first unit is going to be really expensive to produce. You're just starting out. Your workers are not efficient. On average, that first unit is absorbing all of your fixed payments. Then the average total cost is going to fall and fall and fall. It's going to get cheaper and cheaper to produce on average until you hit the marginal cost curve, and then diminishing marginal returns kick in, and your average total cost gets more expensive. That's the summary of what you need to know.
So it only goes back up because of diminishing?
It goes back up because of diminishing marginal returns, because the average fixed cost becomes negligible at a point. Like the car payment, $500. Once you've driven $500 that month, that's $1 of fixed payments per mile. That's nothing. But then each unit starts becoming more and more expensive, which is going to bring up your average. We'll see why this is relevant next week. I could teach this all in one night. I prefer to break it up into 2 chapters. What's the basics, and then how is it relevant? So here's some more good news for you guys. Here's some concepts we're not going to cover. They're too technical for our needs. The first one is isoquants and isocosts. That's the exact same principle as the utility curve. So in your utility, you've got a budget line, and then you're going to maximize your utility. If you have two factors of production, labor and capital, you're going to have a budget line. How much is it going to cost you? You could have all labor or all capital. And then how much you're going to be able to produce using those two. You're going to choose the point of maximum production. This is the kind of stuff that you're going to do someday as managers without the curves. You're going to look at your data. You're going to sit down with your production team and say, okay, this is how much capital costs us, and how much it costs to buy and rent rent and run the machine. This is how much workers are going to cost us. This is how much different combinations of workers and machines go. So if the price of workers go up, maybe because they form a union, maybe because there's a new minimum wage law, maybe because there's a new insurance requirement, how much is that cost going to affect how much you want to use machines instead? You're not going to do it with these graphs. So, but I just want you to be aware of the concept.
So basically, because homework 5, we have to do that, so don't do it.
You've got it. Excel. It's fundamentally more of an Excel problem than an isoquant and isocost problem. And I'll come back to that afterwards. Factor demand curves, same principle, and then longer and average cost and plant size. That's just a fancy, sophisticated graphical and mathematical way of looking at what are your economies and diseconomies of scale. How big should you be? So for certain industries like the car industry, the optimal plant size is going to be a lot bigger than it is going to be for, say, the sandwich shop industry. And then finally, this is a sneak preview of last week. Okay, so we've studied all this stuff. We know about the different kinds of production, marginal production, average product, total product, marginal cost, blah, blah, blah. Great. How much should a company produce? Well, the answer is simply to the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Exactly. So that's not going to mean that you're making a zero profit or breaking even, because the averages, we're going to come back to that, are going to be different. But at any given point of production, ask yourself, could I produce one more unit and earn more on it than it's going to cost me to produce? In other words, is my marginal revenue greater than my marginal cost? If I expect to make more than the cost of production, I should be producing more because I'm leaving money on the table. If I expect that it's going to cost me more to produce it than I'm going to make, then I should not, because I will be using money on that next unit. Then from there, we can determine what the averages are, et cetera. But that's our work for next week. So that covers that in terms of part 1. I think for the homeworks, the best thing is if we have a one-on-one conversation. Somebody had also buzzed in on this. A one-on-one conversation, because each person's going to have different questions. So an email for those of you who are remote, and I can go through all the problems with you. One-on-one conversation, which I'll have now. Are there any questions before we close?
Would it make more sense to stop before you get to 0? That's not good.
Well,
I mean, just like the last unit before you get to 0.
Well,
I guess when you're making that last unit, that doesn't make any money.
Again, so the question was, would it make sense to stop before you get 0? Okay, so we're looking at theoretical ways in a company. In a company, that's the thing, is that you may not be able to get to 0, especially if you're making something small. That's what you're aiming towards, and this is a simplification process. So I'll take other I'll take other questions individually. I'm going to stop the